So, content warning for the next few minutes. We are going to be talking about issues related to clergy sex abuse. So, if these aren't things you want to listen to, just jump forward about 2 minutes. So, you may notice when you're listening to this episode, me and Amy sound a bit different. I'm just coming off of COVID, and Amy said she's started to feel her throat get a little scratchy. This was not intentional, however. When we initially recorded this episode, we extensively pulled from a scholar of early Christianity who is also a pastor who has been credibly implicated in clergy sexual abuse. And we felt like it wasn't a good idea to keep him in this episode. And there was no way that we could edit him out of the episode without just removing most of the content of the episode itself. And the way we originally recorded it there wasn't a way to edit just his parts out while still making the episode coherent. So we recorded the whole planned series of the podcast back to back, and we're not doing that for this episode. So we're doing an emergency re-recording in October. Yeah, that's why we probably sound a little different. I think we both also have new computers and new microphones. Yep, just thought I'd let you know that's why this is happening. Anyway, let's get into the episode. Yeah, the last 6 episodes. Basically, what Amy and I did for the last 6 episodes was depressingly beat on the idea that autistic people are less likely to be Christian, and tried to explain why that is the case, and all the different ways that autistic people struggle with Christianity, all the way that autistic people struggle with the church, why they leave, why they don't join to begin with. And we went in probably more detail than people may have been expecting about why it is that autistic people struggle with Christianity and all of the problems and issues that result from it. And the situation might seem a little bleak, but there's some hope. There's some light at the end of the tunnel, and hopefully we can start doing that and explaining that this episode. At the very beginning of the podcast, one of the things I pointed out is a phrase that you often hear said online by especially autistic ex-Christians. The phrase is, Christianity is religion by neurotypicals for neurotypicals. And my response is, it might feel that way, but it doesn't have to be. And that's what Amy and I are going to be talking about for the next few episodes. To answer the question, what is to be done? What are we supposed to do, basically, with all the information that I've been presenting in the last few episodes? Like, how are we actually supposed to use this information, and what are we actually supposed to do with it? The point I've been trying to get across, and I think both Amy and I were harping on this for quite a while, is that for a lot of autistic people, Christianity feels like fitting a square peg into a round hole. And what is to be done is basically, I like to joke that the main thing that I do when I'm working with autistic Christians is I just come up to them and ask them, why are you trying to put the round peg into the square hole? Why don't you just put the round peg into the round hole that's just like right over there? And I think really when it comes down to a solution, that is what I think the best way forward is for autistic people. It's just to practice Christianity in a way that is sensitive to the way that autistic people practice Christianity, in a way that doesn't really cause them lots of cognitive dissonance. It's a pretty simple solution, and yeah, that's what I'm suggesting. Now, will this work for everyone? No, it won't. It will work for a lot of people, though. And so what we're going to talk about and what we're going to propose is like a solution that'll probably work for 85% of people. There's never any one size fits all approach to things when it comes to autism. And we shouldn't expect Christianity to be any different. So the solution to the problem of what do you do about the fact that autistic people are less likely than their non-autistic counterparts to be Christian? What do you do? First thing is stop trying to put the square peg into the round hole, put the square peg into the square hole. Stop fighting your own neurology and practice a form of Christianity that makes sense to you and that you can make sense of. What I call this approach to Christianity, most people just call it Christianity, but I specifically call it autistic Christianity. It's just practicing Christianity in a way that is sensitive to the particular needs of autistic Christians. So I say autistic Christianity, and a lot of people, the hairs on the back of their neck stand up and they become suspicious because they hear autistic Christianity and they're like, why not just normal Christianity? You seem to be adding something to the gospel. And I don't think that's at all what I'm proposing. Simply put, what I think we should be doing is basically just practicing Christianity in a way that accounts for the particularities of autistic neurology. There's no such thing as like a monolithic autistic Christianity. I don't think if you said, I'm practicing an autistic form of Christianity, there would be one description of it. There wouldn't be one denomination. There wouldn't be one set of theology for it. All that I'm doing is basically saying we should be practicing, or we should be doing a form of Christianity that is adaptive to the particular needs of autistic people, that emphasizes aspects that complement autistic ways of thinking and interacting with the world, and de-emphasizing the factors that conflict with autistic thinking. Yeah, that's basically all I'm proposing. And there's a reason that I'm proposing this. And the reason is it works. That's basically the only reason. So I've talked to a lot of autistics, a lot of autistic Christians, as I'm sure you are now aware from the podcasts that we've been recording, talked to a lot of them. And we may have been giving the impression that every autistic person just struggles with Christianity and it's a minefield. And to some extent, it is. To some extent, that is a fairly accurate perception. But there are a lot of autistic people who have made Christianity work for them, or practice Christianity in a way that works for them. And basically what they've done is they've just found an autistic practice of Christianity. They have gone through all of the steps that I'm about to propose and just done it themselves. and they're just living their best life. And so if I were to try to provide a definition of autistic Christianity, I'd basically say it's a form of Christianity that emerges when Christianity is read through an autistic lens and fully within the bounds of a normal or a normative definition of Christian orthodoxy, but has features and characteristics that make it unique or at least uncommon in the majority of expressions of Christianity. And so it's basically a cluster of interpretive lenses, interpretive tendencies, frameworks for trying to understand the world, and spiritual practices. If you think about it, one of the analogies I use is if you think about the wide diversity of Christianity, just take any tradition, look at Catholicism, look at how it's practiced in Italy, look at how it's practiced in South America. While there are lots of common trends, there are also a lot of differences in the way that they're practiced. And the reason that they're practiced that way is to account for the various different cultural differences in those countries. But yeah, that's what I think we should do about it, is just encourage autistic people to practice a form of autistic Christianity. Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Amy?
Yeah, I think that's pretty evident from what we've discussed in the last 6 episodes, where those 6 episodes were about our struggles with Christianity, why some of us have walked away from Christianity altogether, why some people are just not interested in looking into it. But interwoven throughout all of those conversations have been those of us who have struggled with it until we found a way to make it work for us. And yeah, there seem to be some commonalities to it which are already apparent. So it'd be interesting to see how much of that is connected in this episode. Yeah, because I'm already noticing certain patterns in those previous episodes and discussions that we've had.
And basically, I also think another good reason why we should encourage people to do this is because it's pretty simple to implement as well, costs very few resources, and autistic people will just naturally do this anyway. And so my argument is they're going to naturally do this and stay in the church. You might as well know what it is they're doing.
Yeah.
And so when I talk to pastors and clergy and people like that, and I explain that, like, one of my solution to this problem is for autistic parishioners to practice a form of Christianity that I've called autistic Christianity. And I get really 4 objections to that pretty consistently. The first one is, why bother? Which we'll address. The next one, is it legitimate? Is it still orthodox? Are you suggesting that my parishioners become heretics? The next question is, what happens if non-autistic people misunderstand it? And then finally, the fourth question that I often get is, why should we make accommodations when doctrine and praxis could be at stake? So to answer the first question, why bother, is number one, hopefully you don't ask that question if you've listened to the last 6 episodes. Hopefully by now you got a pretty good idea why you should probably bother about it. But one of the things that I try to explain is that autistic people as a whole belong to a sort of distinct culture. Now, when I say distinct culture, I don't mean that there is some sort of autistic monoculture. In fact, I know there is not an autistic monoculture. It's actually more accurate to say that autistic people belong to lots of different autistic subcultures, some of them multiple different autistic subcultures, but
Yeah.
there isn't like one overarching autistic culture. This is something that I like, just a technical mistake that I see a lot of online autism advocates make. They talk about autistic culture or autistic ways of being, and actually what they're talking about is just their subculture and just assuming that it's everyone's subculture. And generally speaking, I think that's just, it's an analytical mistake, but it's an analytical mistake that can have some pretty unfortunate implications when you actually take it to its most logical conclusions. Because basically, what happens when you say that there's an autistic culture is the dominant group of autistics in that culture becomes the one who set the idea of what the culture is. And so you basically just have
Oh, yeah.
a re-replication of hegemony, but instead of it being like a neurotypical hegemony, it's an autistic hegemony. And it's usually an autistic hegemony of English speaking upper class white people, because that's the demographic that has the largest percentage of autism diagnoses. And so when I say autistic people belong to a distinct culture, I don't mean like culture as in we're all in this one melting pot. What I'm saying is that autistic people have, in general, distinctive methods of understanding and interpreting information that are typically shared across the community. There
Yeah.
are general trends in spiritual practices that we will tend to cluster around. There are things that we tend to avoid doing, things that we often stigmatize, things that we often reject that will differ from surrounding cultures, things that we prioritize and elevate, and things that we would elevate that most people probably wouldn't. And we have our own ways of navigating social norms and social expectations that probably differ from the average person. And as more people get diagnosed with autism and the autism population, or I guess I should say the self-aware autism population grows, then I think it's going to become even more pronounced. And so because autistic people generally have these sorts of cultural differences, there is a need, I think, to translate Christianity cross-culturally. And this is something that I think most people understand, most Christians understand, is that Christianity needs to go through cultural translation. And
Yeah.
one of the biggest problems, I think, and I think if you could just summarize what we've been talking about for the last 6 episodes, is that a lot of times this cultural translation simply hasn't occurred. And so when you ask the question, like, why bother? It's because there are a lot of people in our community who simply either will never be interested in listening to what Christians have to say. If they are interested in listening to what Christians have to say, there's a pretty good chance that they're going to misunderstand it, or they're going to do that thing that we've been describing in the past 6 episodes of taking your cultural practices and trying to fit them into a framework that doesn't actually work and doesn't actually make sense for them, and ultimately causes them a lot of stress and grief. And like, when I suggest this and I get asked, why bother? Like, why should we try to do this? I think the pretty clear answer to that is because autistic people need it. And that's kind of it. And hopefully at this point, we've given you enough information to convince you of the idea that there's a need. Yeah. There's a lot of examples I can give. Like, one of the most common emails that I've been getting since we've started this podcast is people sending me emails saying, like, how did you know how to describe my life? It's like you were following me with a video camera through church. My response to that is, well, I have an elaborate spy drone network that finds autistic people. No.
Jonathan, we weren't supposed to spill that.
Yeah. In addition to online data collecting, I decided to go with a more aggressive approach of following you around with spy drones.
That was meant to be confidential, but anyway.
Yeah. We punctured OPSEC. It's all over. It's all over now. We got to recall the drones. But a lot of autistic people have just been listening to what I've been saying, and I've got quite a few messages from autistic women talking about a lot of the experiences that you've been specifically describing, Amy. And they're like, wow, how did you guys get this so close to what I'm actually experiencing? And the actual answer to that is, I've just been collecting data for a really long time, and Amy's been really deeply involved in the autism community for a long time. So we've just seen a lot of this. and once you see a large enough population set, you can start building trends. And yeah, like, a lot of autistic people, when they come to me asking for help, and I explain to them, hey, you don't actually, Christianity shouldn't feel like you're smacking your head with a book every time you walk into church. It doesn't need to be that way. I'm not going to promise you that Christianity is going to be super fun all the time and that it's going to be just smooth sailing. It's not. Most people shouldn't have to describe their experience with Christianity as a lifelong and constant struggle. And the number of people who are constantly saying, thank you for letting me know I'm not crazy, or thanks for giving me a way of doing Christianity that makes sense to me, or thanks for putting words to my experience, I thought this was just me, or thanks for letting me know that Christianity shouldn't just be confusion and suffering. I think just by the sheer volume of those things that I hear, it should be enough to say, look, like, this is a legitimate thing that actually has a need that people are asking for that should be implemented. And I don't think anyone's first kick at the can at these things is ever going to be particularly successful. But yeah, we should at least do something. We should at least try. And I know this particular way of doing things works for most people. The next question I get is, why not just plain old Christianity? And I think I'll toss that over to you, Amy, just to see what your answer is. Why not just plain old Christianity?
Because there's no such thing as plain old Christianity.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think it's because what a lot of people consider to be quote unquote plain old Christianity is always going to be filtered through a bias. If a person from a Baptist church says, why not do plain old Christianity? To them, plain old Christianity is probably going to be through the Baptist filter. If a Pentecostal says that, it's going to be through a more Pentecostal filter. If someone from Denmark says that, it's going to be from a Danish filter. And if someone says from the United States says that, it's going to be through their American filter. It's not something that we can be completely objective about, because we're human. We come into our own understanding of God. And yes, while we experience transformation through that encounter with God, whichever means, it still doesn't change the fact that we're human and we're coming into it and coming through it with our own experiences and filters. So we can't really be objective with it. We're not God. We don't see all things. We have a limited scope of understanding. And yet that limited scope of understanding is not invalidated. I think in some ways, like whenever something is brought outside of our own bubble of culture and personal views of the world, we can feel like, oh, but that is against what I think is true. And that can almost feel like knee-jerking. And a lot of, like, the thing is, with all of that in consideration, what's to say that the way that autistic people relate to God, relate to Christianity, is not itself plain old Christianity? I understand there are concerns about what if the autistic person has unorthodox views about God or church teaching and the like. But again, there's a potential for that in any expression of Christianity, and yet we don't have as much, I don't know, like of a pushback when it's within our own communities. Yeah, so I think it's just, yeah, for the very simple fact that Christianity, when we live it out, it's always going to have an element of being subjective anyway.
Yep. Yeah, and just to echo everything you said, 100%. Why not just plain old Christianity? Because no one has ever practiced plain old Christianity. There is no neutral set of Christianity from which other people just tinker with or make deviations. Every form of Christianity is culturally contingent.
Yeah.
Every form of Christianity gets passed through a set of cultural filters and a set of cultural biases, and every set of Christianity is tied to the context in which it's practiced. There, like, you can't do a neutral form of Christianity, and this is completely normal, right? This is 100% should be expected. And,
Yeah.
autistic Christians have been practicing these forms of Christianity, like an autistic form of Christianity, for a very long time in the church, completely legitimately, without any
Yeah.
issues. It's just never actually been called autistic Christianity. It's just been autistic people finding a way to practice Christianity in a way that makes sense for them. And so that's why not plain old Christianity. The next question, is it legitimate? And this is probably the question that I have spent most of my time agonizing over, because like most autistic people, I don't care if it feels good or if it makes sense, if it's heresy. Not legitimate, if it's not sanctionable, if it's not something that should be happening, then it doesn't really matter if it feels good. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And initially, I had doubts about the whole idea, but then as I started thinking about it, as I started talking to other autistic clergy and things like that, a lot of my doubts were alleviated. I have a lot of sort of natural skepticism about anyone we should start doing this different thing than the thing
Oh,
that we're
yeah.
already doing. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of autistic people have that. We're not exactly known for our amazing abilities to deal with change and deal with new things. I agonized over this for a while, and there are a few things I'll say about this. My proposal isn't to do a new thing or to invent a new thing. My proposal is basically saying, let's just put words on an existing phenomena. Let's just take something that happens and let's just codify it and explain what it actually is, so that autistic people don't need to go through the kind of difficult and arduous process of reinventing a thing that already exists for themselves. Uh, you know,
Yeah.
it happens thousands of times every year by autistic Christians, where they do this their own thing and they figure out their own thing. And all I'm saying is we could save a lot of time, energy, and effort by just saying, actually, what you're doing is this, and help them along the way. So there are a lot of questions that come up with, is this legitimate? And one of the things that I say when I'm talking to clergy is, this is probably the most legitimate thing that I've ever done with respect to Christianity, mostly because something that I like to point out is that Christianity, like, one of the most Christian things you can do is adapt Christianity to its own specific cultural context. And this has been happening since Christianity was invented. Or, I'll re-say that. Some people might get offended.
Mm.
This has been happening since Christianity actually started. And so, like, you can go through all sorts of examples. So, what Christianity looked like, at least in the first few centuries, you basically had Christianity and this sort of Orthodox core of Christian belief established at councils. So you had ecumenical councils of people who all came together and said, okay, this is what Christianity is, and they argued and they debated about who was in and who was out. But when they left those ecumenical councils and they went back to their own specific cultures, they would adapt these teachings into their language, they would adapt these teachings into their culture, and they would adapt these teachings into their cultural practice. And wherever Christian missionaries went, they would start by doing a few things. And one of them was figuring out ways to use the culture around them to explain what they're talking about.
Yeah.
The famous example of this is in the book of Acts. Paul is preaching at Mars Hill in Greece, basically using cultural knowledge of the statue to the unknown god, basically saying, see, you have this thing, let me use these things that you already have in your culture to explain the Christian message. And doing this type of thing is basically the most Christian thing that you can possibly do.
Yeah.
One example that I like to give is just talking about the Christianization of Scandinavia and Germany and England. If you look at how missionary efforts actually worked in the Middle Ages, going to all those places, it's interesting, right? Because the pagan Norse cultures and the pagan English cultures were very different from Christian cultures and very different from the Roman and Greek cultures
Mm.
from which Christianity was emerging. And it's really interesting seeing the artifacts that come from that. So there are all sorts of like interesting artifacts that still exist. So there is a very long poem. I'm going to absolutely butcher the pronunciation of this, but it's called the Heliand, and it's basically just a poem that re-explains the gospel, but in sort of terms that make sense to Norse culture. So Jesus doesn't have disciples, he has like a warrior band that follows him around, and the way that Jesus talks and the way that how he explains what he's going to do is in ways that would make sense to the people of that culture and not to the Greek audience that the Gospel of Luke, for example, was probably intended to be heard by. And
Yeah.
you see this basically all throughout there. So one early example that you find in one account of the Christianization of Scandinavia is the Sermon on the Mount. So the Sermon on the Mount didn't really make a whole lot of sense to a lot of these Scandinavians. They had their own specific way of understanding different sets of, like, they had their own legal system with
Yeah.
debts and with suing and with and a whole culture around that. And when you read the things in the Sermon on the Mount, they're talking about cultural practices that didn't exactly make sense to a lot of the Scandinavians. So instead of translating the Sermon on the Mount literally to their language, what the German missionaries did was they tried to find approximations. And so things like turn the other cheek, or found in the Sermon on the Mount, wasn't translated as turn the other cheek, but it was translated as do not unfairly sue someone or bring legal charges against them that are unjust and unjustified, and things like that. And
Yeah.
this happens all over Europe when Europe is being Christianized. There's a really famous cross in England called the Ruthwell Cross. And the Ruthwell Cross is basically this very large stone cross. It was destroyed during the Protestant Reformation. It was broken apart during the Reformation. They were able to reconstruct it. But it's basically this cross that shows Jesus as the son of a warrior chieftain come down to save humanity by dying for it on its behalf. And a lot of the portrayals of Jesus in the English Christianization portray him in terms that the British people could understand, which was not as a itinerant preacher in Galilee, but as the son of a warrior chieftain, basically. And
Right. Yeah.
in all these situations, what's happening is the message of the gospel isn't actually being changed. If you look at like the Hellion and or the Ruthwell Cross, all these things, you would look at them and you'd be able to draw like clear one-to-one parallels and say, okay, yeah, they're just not using words and concepts that these people would find confusing.
Yeah.
Another good example of this is something called the Huron Carol. So the Huron are a First Nations tribe here in Canada, and when Canadian missionaries came to Canada, they wrote this carol to explain the nativity or the birth of Jesus. And when you're explaining to First Nations tribes about things like wise men and shepherds and things like that, they don't have shepherds, right? They're not agrarian, livestock based culture. And so
Yeah.
instead, in the Huron Carol, Jesus is met by chieftains, by three great chieftains, and he's visited not by shepherds, but he's visited by hunters who bring gifts of beaver pelt and things like that. And
Oh wow.
they do these things not because they are like, I can't wait to change the gospel, but they're like, obviously the materials that were brought to Jesus aren't of the utmost concern. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get a message across. And so in order to get that message across, we're just going to put this through cultural translation. The exact same things happened in North Africa and Syria. If you look at Christianization of those areas, especially there's this one guy, his name is Ephraim the Syriac, and he was very famous for being this Orthodox Christian that would battle with heretics and various other pagan religions, and he would battle with them basically through hymns, through writing hymns that explained Orthodoxy. Except they were it was basically he was taking a poetry and music convention of his area, and he was using that poetry and music convention to explain what Christianity is. And there are lots of other examples. If you want to look for modern ones, basically just talk to any sort of missionary Bible translators. Actually, a lot of them are also autistic. I've discovered.
Oh my
but,
goodness.
but yeah, talk to some missionary Bible translators. They will often tell you that when they're trying to translate the Bible into a different language, or when they're trying to explain the Bible in a different culture, they've got to use very different terms, very different ways of explaining things to get the Christian message across. And when I get asked, is this legitimate? Is what you're doing good or normal? It's like, buddy, this is one of the most normal things that I've ever proposed we do in Christianity.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so the next kind of big question I get is this orthodox? Are you encouraging people into heresy? And I would say, no, I'm not. What I'm proposing is not that we dispense with the creeds, or that we don't adopt Christian teachings, or that we don't hold to a form of Christian orthodoxy. I'm basically just saying there is a lot of the Christian faith that is non-negotiable, but there's also an enormous amount of it that actually is negotiable. And the parts of it that are negotiable, we should negotiate them, and we should negotiate them on behalf of autistic people, for autistic people, in order to
Yeah.
help them come to terms with Christianity. That's all I'm proposing. These questions come up, so I think I should address them. A lot of autistic people, as we've talked about, have a sort of anti-supernatural bias, and a lot of autistic people have a pretty deep skepticism when it comes to a lot of the supernatural claims of Christianity, and you'll have a lot of them who are perhaps interested in Christianity but unwilling to get on board with the supernatural claims. Now, some people, when they hear me talk about this, what they hear me say is, we should say, yeah, you can practice Christianity and just not adhere to the supernatural claims because you're autistic and you have these specific concerns. I just want to be really clear. That's not what I'm proposing. Mostly because I just think Christian orthodoxy requires belief in supernatural claims. I just don't think there's a way that you can square orthodoxy with not having a physical bodily resurrection or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And so what I'm proposing isn't that we change the core, it's that we change everything around the core that needs to be changed to make it as frictionless as possible, because we've been explaining how many friction points there are for autistic people. And if you remove half of those friction points, just even removing half of them is going to be amazing, right? Like, it's going to be such a huge improvement that you should do this. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
one analogy is that orthodoxy is like a seed. So you have this core part of Christianity that doesn't change, but depending on where you plant it, it's still going to grow into a tree. It just, depending on the soil and the environment you plant it in, the tree's going to maybe grow a bit differently in that place. It might
Yeah.
sprout different types of leaves. It might look a little different. At like the fundamental part of it, it's still the same tree. Like, the DNA is still there. It's just a little different. Now, another thing that I'd like to point out here when I get asked this, and this is actually an exercise that I do with clergy when I'm talking to them, is I get asked, so all these questions, is it legitimate? Why not plain old Christianity? Why bother? And one of the other things that I bring up that actually you brought up, I think in episode 2, maybe episode 1, is the parable of the lost sheep, right?
Yes.
Question, why bother? We're such a small percentage of the population. We're like 1% of the population, and just so happens that there's a parable in Christianity about leaving the 99 to find the one. Objection of, why should we bother? You only make up around 1% of the population. Wouldn't our resources be better served somewhere else? So as like a heartless utilitarian, that logic does appeal to me to some extent. Don't get me wrong. I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong. But for a lot of reasons. Number one, there are a lot of people in the church who are not particularly suited for other forms of ministry, but are really suited for ministry to autistic people. It's not like having those people devoted to ministry to autistic people is going to take away from anyone else. My efforts are probably not spent very well on the general population, but are probably very well spent on the autistic population itself. Yeah. There's the idea that this is a zero-sum game or that we're in resource competition is just, it's a weird idea that people get, like it's not reality. But another thing I like to point out is the parable of the lost sheep itself. The parable of the lost sheep is really interesting, and I find it interesting because it not only appears in the canon, it also appears in texts outside the canon. And in one particular text called the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is a non-canonical sayings gospel, so it's basically just a list of supposed sayings of Jesus. It's written in Coptic. People date it all over the place. Some people date it very early. I don't think there are particularly good reasons to date it early, but most people put it in the 2nd century as being written then. It's often characterized as being proto-Gnostic, so not necessarily itself a Gnostic text, but part of a community that would later evolve into a Gnostic community. I jokingly refer to myself as a certified Gospel of Thomas hater, but I think that it's interesting to draw comparisons between the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Thomas. And so we'll just read them here.
From the Gospel of Luke. Which one of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? When he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders and rejoices. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost. From the Gospel of Thomas. The Father's kingdom is like a shepherd who had 100 sheep. One of them, the largest, went astray. He left the 99 and looked for the one until he found it. After he had toiled, he said to the sheep, I love you more than the 99.
So the interpretation of the Gospel of Thomas reading is maybe a little difficult. It's a little weird. He's saying one of the sheep, the largest, went astray, and he left the 99 and looked for it. And when he found it, he toiled and said to his sheep, I love you more than the 99. The interpretation of that is by scholars is interesting. In Gnostic belief, there's this Gnosticism, if you don't know, is a heretical form of Christianity from the 2nd century. It's a fusion of Neoplatonism and Christianity in some pretty weird ways. Yeah. Anyway, I just realized as I was talking about this, people might not even have a clue what I'm talking about. So that's my brief overview of it. And right now, scholars of early Christianity are coming for me with pitchforks, being like, "That's not Gnosticism." I know this is not a podcast about defining Gnosticism. This is a podcast about autism. And because it's a podcast about autism, I'm very sensitive about the fact that if I start talking about Gnosticism, this podcast is going to be 4 hours. I'm not going to do that. We're not here for that. So the interpretation of the Gospel of Thomas is that the largest sheep is actually like the sheep with special knowledge, the good sheep, the important one. And Jesus doesn't really care about the other 99. He cares about the special one with special knowledge. And this is completely the opposite of what's found in the Gospel of Luke. In the Gospel of Luke, every sheep is important to Jesus. The 99 are important, but so is the one who's gone astray. And there is no distinction between who's better than who, and there is no prioritization of one set of sheep over the other set of sheep. The only retelling of this story in which there is a explicit prioritization of one type of sheep over the other, it's the heretical Gnostic one. In the proto-Orthodox version of this story, what we have is we have a story that is one where every sheep of the 100 flock is important, and Jesus goes out of his way to find the one who's lost and the one that needs help to bring it back into the flock. What I'm proposing here is just plain old standard normative Christian practices that have been there since the writing of the Gospel of Luke, at least, likely before that when Jesus told this parable, right? So this is a completely normal Orthodox Christian practice. Again, when I say Orthodox, I should clarify, small o Orthodox. I'm not talking about like Eastern Orthodox. I'm saying Orthodox is in Orthodox meaning not heretical. But yeah, so I think if you need biblical justification for what you're doing, the Gospel of Luke and the parable of the lost sheep is the easiest thing to point to. And it's a good thing to point to, right? It's a good thing to actually base things off of that. Sometimes, to extend the metaphor, sometimes when a sheep is lost, you sometimes need to do things that might not be comfortable, that might be difficult to do, and that might take a lot of time and effort to do in order to get that sheep back. And all I'm doing is saying we should put in some effort to that. And lots of people are willing to do it. Lots of autistic people are willing to do it. And so, yeah, I think hopefully we're doing a good job of making the case. But yeah, so a lot of people get nervous. Again, I completely understand why you get nervous. I'm not here to say you shouldn't be nervous about this, because oftentimes when people propose, let's do something new in Christianity, they end up reinventing 10 different heresies. It's always really funny, right? They're like, we need to be doing Christianity a new way. And they're like, oh, what kind of way do you propose? And it's just like a list of things that are like accidentally revived a whole bunch of 7th century heresies. I understand why people might not want to do that. And I understand the impulse to be defensive. I understand that Christianity is inherently conservative. I don't mean like conservative in a political sense, but conservative in that it's slow to change and that it is intending to preserve something. And so I understand why people get nervous when you are proposing something that sounds new. One thing that I will say is practicing Christianity in an autistic way, I don't actually think it's new. I think people have been doing this since the Middle Ages, if not way before that.
You can't tell me that monasticism isn't as autistic as all hell.
Well, there's a post about it, and it's like special interest, the Lord. Yeah, that's medieval monasticism often to an extent. And I think that what we're actually doing here is we're just taking a normal, legitimate way of practicing Christianity that is practiced by a very small minority and just letting most people know that this exists and that you can do this and it's fine. And that's all I'm really proposing we do. Now, another thing that I want to talk about that I think is really important is people get very nervous, like I said, and people go like, why can't you just talk about the things that all Christians care about? Why can't you just do these other things? And I get very frustrated with that because, again, what you're doing is you're basically saying, hey, this like culture that you find difficult to penetrate and difficult to understand, why don't you just adhere to its norms? That's literally the problem. This comes up a lot in Christian apologetics. So if you look at the sort of modern Christian apologetics industrial complex, I'll call it, like your like William Lane Craig, Josh McDowell, Lee Strobel types, inspiring philosophy, they are answering questions. They are answering questions asked by a certain community. That community usually tends to be the largest cultural group that exists. But one thing that I've learned, especially since doing this podcast and doing these types of interviews, is that a lot of people from different cultures have very different questions that aren't being answered by the apologetics industrial complex. A really good example of this is apologetics questions that are being asked in Black American churches. So the types of things that they are typically wrestling with in those churches are not questions of, like, does God exist? Do we have evidence for the resurrection? Those aren't really the questions that people are getting asked.
Yeah.
What are getting asked are questions about what is Christianity's relationship to white supremacy, and what is Christianity's relation? Is Christianity a white man's religion type of thing?
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to look at the differences between the way apologetics is done in the black community in America versus how it's done in the white community. Now, there are still lots of black people who are interested in what I'll call, like, classical apologetics, like reading
Yeah.
Aquinas and all that stuff. Like, that's not at all what I'm not saying that they aren't interested in those types of things, but what I'm saying is that in their specific communities, there are often lots of questions that get asked that don't get asked by the dominant culture that they
Yeah.
need to reckon with and they need to contend with. And I think that we're basically in an analogous situation in which our community and our cultural context, we just have so many different types of questions that we're asking, and the
Yeah.
ways that they're being answered aren't particularly satisfying. And so, understandably, like, people get nervous when you talk about this stuff, but there's getting nervous about it and then doing nothing, and getting nervous
Yeah.
about it and coming up with a solution that you may not like the look of, but at least it works. And I'm suggesting, even if you don't like the look of this, you should at least be willing to give it some space. So a common type of problem that autistic people face in our communities, especially within Christianity, are questions about, like, biblical inerrancy and things like that. And a lot of people get very nervous because the way I handle biblical inerrancy is often not how they would want to, because there are standard apologetic defenses for biblical inerrancy. And I don't use
Yeah.
any of those, and I just completely ignore them because I just know in our culture that won't work, right? Like, in our context, none of these arguments are going to be persuasive.
No.
One example, I pretty much never give apologetic defenses of the resurrection at all. Apologetic defenses in the sense that trying to historically prove the resurrection from first principles, like Gary Habermas or Mike Lacona or Lee Strobel. Like, I don't
Yeah.
do the case for Christ thing. And I don't do the case for Christ thing because I've just found overall autistic people don't find it even remotely convincing. And when you suggest that, they often think that you're dumb. I don't know how else to put it, but, like, they'll be like, "Oh, this person just isn't very good at thinking," and so, like,
Oh my
there
God.
people, like, get nervous when I don't do that, or when I'm talking to an autistic person and they say, I have all these problems with biblical inerrancy, and it's like, cool, man, me too. Let's what are your issues, and I'll tell you mine. And people from the outside watching that get nervous, like, they go, oh no, what's
Yeah.
going on? You're not addressing these things apologetically in the way that you should. Like, you're not defending the doctrines according
Yeah.
to the standard that we want you to defend them. And so it does make people nervous, and I get that it makes people nervous. I get that people don't like it, but at the end of the day, a lot of times this is what you need to do. Like, we've talked about autistic people, we get fixated on things, we get really into stuff, and we don't let it go, to put it lightly. So, like,
No.
one really good example that comes up a lot is the story of Laban and Jacob from Genesis. And so in this story, I'll just quickly summarize it. Jacob is working for a guy named Laban, and he makes a deal that all the goats that come out speckled will be his. So he's working for this guy. It's like, okay, I'll work for
Yeah.
you, but I get all the speckled goats. You can have all the non-speckled goats. And in this story, Jacob, basically, while the goats are drinking, he puts a speckled stick in front of them so that their coats will come out speckled. And so what's going on here is the author of this story in Genesis is using a story to convey Jacob as like a crafty trickster type guy who's very smart and cunning. And what's going on for autistic people is they're like, that's not how genetics works. You can't do that. It doesn't work. And so when you talk about things like biblical inerrancy and stuff like that, they get really hung up on this question of how can I call the Bible inerrant when it doesn't understand genetics? We know genetics to be true, and we know that this isn't true. And there's often no room for me to go, let's just agree to disagree. Let's just let it be. And so people get nervous because I'll say, yeah, you're right. This is wrong about genetics. But good thing the Bible isn't a genetics textbook. Anyway, moving on. And I'll basically just go, look, you don't have to believe that this is transferring information to you about genetics. You can believe that this is an error. It's fine. And I basically do that because autistic people, if you don't do that, get really fixated on it. And it's like, imagine you're having coffee with someone and you're having a conversation about what new color you want to paint your bathroom. And then right outside, there's a massive car crash that happens. And you're like, no, we need to really figure out what color I need to paint my bathroom. And like cars keep crashing outside of the coffee shop. That the cars crashing outside the coffee shop is the autistic brain hyperfixating on, but that's wrong. But there's an error. And you're trying to tell, I can't move on telling you about the colors of what color you should paint your bathroom when there are car crashes going out outside. And yeah, like I said, I am sensitive to concerns that people will find this uncomfortable and people will find this difficult. And that when I talk about it, a lot of pastors from some denominations will get more sensitive about it than others. But there are just going to be some parts of what we understand to be Christianity that are probably going to be interpreted differently through an autistic lens. Like I said, I wouldn't advocate for changing anything in the creeds or anything in like the core beliefs of Christianity at all. I'm pretty rigid and inflexible about that type of thing. But basically, there are a lot of things outside the creeds, like the understanding of the biblical text and how we're supposed to interpret it, that I'm more than open to different interpretations. In most cases, a lot of times we have to be careful with quirks of autistic neurology in ways that we're not really careful with other people. And we have to be a lot more accommodating with specifically autistic people about intellectual hyperfixation, because we get really intellectually hyperfixated on stuff. So like, when I was coming back into Christianity, I was looking at Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Anglicanism, and Lutheranism. And I was unable to assent to Catholicism for many reasons, and similar Orthodoxy, but for slightly fewer reasons. And so at the end of the day, I had really the two options I had were Anglican and Lutheran. And one of the things that I often explain to people is I decided to become Anglican because there's this Lutheran document called the Book of Concord, which is basically, this is a book of everything we doctrinally agree with. And that made me very nervous because I went through the Book of Concord and I went, okay, I can assent to this. This isn't an issue for me. And then I had this thought, what if in the future I change my mind on something and I no longer agree with this? Can I stay? And I neurotically tied myself into a knot where for 2 months, I was like, okay, I can become Lutheran, but can I become Lutheran? Because what if in the future, there is some future in which I learn new information and this information stops me from being able to agree with the Book of Concord? And I just realized that Anglicanism didn't have that. It'd be a lot easier if I just joined the Anglican Church. So practically and logistically, I was like, okay, I'm going to become an Anglican. But for a lot of people, don't really appreciate those types of autistic quirks. And me, that's a pretty tame one. When it comes to it, I think that you are valid in feeling nervous about these things. Like feeling nervous about wanting things to be done differently is a completely valid concern, and you might be nervous with the way that autistic people do things differently. Common examples that we've given a lot of us really struggle with verbal spontaneous prayer. It's
Yeah.
difficult for us and it's uncomfortable for us. Some of us don't struggle with it, but a lot of us do. And
Yeah.
so my recommendation to people is just don't bother struggling with it. Just
Yeah.
go with formal structured prayers. There's literally nothing wrong with using someone else's words to pray. Like it
Yeah.
it isn't bad. You're not doing anything wrong. If you read a prayer and you go, I resonate with this, just say it. Just repeat it. Just do that. But a lot of people get really nervous with me because I say, you don't really have to engage in verbal spontaneous prayer. Or another big one, probably the one that spawned the most emails of people going, oh, thank you for saying this, was the idea of rejecting the idea of a personal relationship with Jesus, where a lot of autistic people are like, this framing just doesn't make sense. The personal relationship doesn't make sense to me. I don't know
Yeah.
how I'm supposed to have this with Jesus. And so I understand why people get really nervous when you say you should just let them reject those ideas. You should just let them do their own kind of weird thing. But at the end of the day, you will get nervous. But the option that you're dealing with isn't this autistic person is just going to practice my form of Christianity. It's this autistic person is going to leave, or this autistic person is going to become depressed or
Yeah.
anxious, or is going to struggle with a lot of fairly serious mental health issues. And I'm sometimes people accuse me of holding them hostage to be like, if you don't accept this, they'll become depressed or they'll leave Christianity. And I'm not doing that to hold you hostage. I'm doing that to just describe reality, right? If
Yeah.
you impose effect A, it will have effect B. Like, there is a very clear line between these two things. And a lot of things that you hold to be very important to your form of Christianity and your practice of Christianity don't need to be important for everyone. And
Yeah.
yeah, some final notes. A lot of autistic people practice Christianity in a way that is very helpful to themselves and other autistic people, but I try not to emphasize this too much, mostly because I think it can sometimes be taken in some unhelpful directions. But
Mm.
there is a lot of benefit for other people as well, right? Like autistic people being in the church and autistic people practicing Christianity in the way that they do doesn't just help the autistic people, it helps other people around them, right? Because
Yeah.
just as a whole, diversity is very important in understanding things. The more different perspectives you get, the better you will be able to understand things. It's just like one more data point to add to your data pile. And a lot of times, autistic people are often familiar with dealing with some aspects of the faith that other people might not be. And we found ways to navigate those aspects that a lot of people haven't because they don't have to deal with it 24/7. An example I give is figuring out how to cope with the silence of God. A lot of people really struggle with this for very good reasons. This is a very normal, classic problem in theism where you feel connected to God, you feel like God is speaking to you, and then all of a sudden you don't. And
Oh,
you
yeah.
don't maybe for a period of time. Like Mother Teresa wrote in her journals that she had felt God's calling, but now she is not. And some atheists use this to be like, see, Mother Teresa was a fraud. And it's that's not what's going on. But
No.
anyway, a lot of autistic people are very used to dealing with this, very comfortable with it. It's like that meme where a guy's on the gallows and he looks at another guy and he's first time. You know?
Yes.
And so I think there's a lot of ways that autistic people can meaningfully and legitimately help the people around them, because experiences of
Yeah.
autistic people aren't unique only to autistic people. Other people will have those experiences, right? Like they just may not have them as
Mm.
frequently, they might not have them as intensely, but the things
Yeah.
that autistic people feel are things that humans feel, right? And
Oh,
we just
exactly.
tend to feel them a lot and for a long time. And so we are often really good at dealing with them because they are a normal part of our regular everyday reality, that might not be for you. And so we can actually be very helpful to other people, and we can actually really help the church when it comes to understanding just a lot of things. Because when you are dealing with an autistic neurology, you will often deal with a lot of issues to some extremes that some people will experience a few times. But again, it's standing on the gallows being like, oh yeah, I remember this. Someone came to me and was like, have you ever dealt with feeling like socially isolated and disconnected in church? And it's
like
brother,
my whole life. Oh my god.
Yeah. And so there are a lot of ways that acknowledging this form of Christianity and acknowledging this practice of Christianity can also just have benefits for other people.
Yeah.
Finally, the last thing I want to talk about before we wrap things up is talking about other solutions that autistic people have asked me about. Some autistic people are like, why don't we start our own autistic denomination? And lots of reasons is the answer. Number one, I don't want to. It doesn't make any sense. We should just stay. The church is not a club for only people who are similar to each other, right?
Yeah.
And it never has been. You should be part of the church body because you are a member of the human race, and Christianity is a universal religion. You belong in the church, not in the autism church. Now, if there are like autistic services, like low sensory mass or whatever, go to those. Those are great. I have no problem with that.
Yeah.
Those are within a church body or a church denomination. A lot of people don't really think about the practical considerations for these types of churches or these denominations. I have thought a lot about them. I will save you all the time. It would be bad. It wouldn't work. When autistic people are great, but sometimes when autistic people get together in large numbers, we do nothing but fight each other. And especially over matters like Christianity, where you don't have a way of resolving theological issues. If you want a church where it's nonstop arguing with each other and turning low stakes issues into high stakes issues, that's a great place to find. And just numerically, it's not feasible, right? If you look at how many autistic people there are, how many of those autistic people are interested in regular church attendance and all those types of things, and then there's no point in having an autistic denomination. And I also think an autistic denomination would be bad. Like it wouldn't be good for autistic people. It wouldn't be good for non-autistic people. I think there's something to be said about autistic parachurch organizations.
Yes.
Not church itself, but just like groups of autistic Christians gathering together. I think that's a good thing. I don't think you should be breaking off to start your own church. I think you should be part of a church and also meet up with other autistic people as part of that church. That's my only thing to say about that. A lot of people propose that to me, and I'm always like, no. Anyway, so I thought I'd just explain that. And what about an autism specific theology? Why should we build an autism specific theology? My response to that is go ahead and try. Like, I'm not going to fight you. I'm not going to stop you. I'm probably not going to practice it. Like, I'm in terms of actually being able to pull it off, it's an incredibly difficult maneuver to build an autism specific theology, mostly because autism is just very complicated, right? It covers a very wide breadth of different types of people, and across, like, it has different cultural expressions. If you look at Asian autistics, especially Asian autistic Christians versus Canadian autistic Christians versus like Dutch autistic Christians, versus American autistic Christians, they all do theology very differently. And to be able to include them all in one batch and actually address all their concerns is just not possible without excluding them. It's like that problem of defining the image of God that we talked about in, I think, episode episode 4, where every time you attempt to put technical definitions on the image of God, you accidentally end up excluding people by mistake. And so you just shouldn't I feel similarly about autism theology, because a lot of times the people who do autism theology are autistic people who don't have intellectual disabilities. And so they will build an autistic theology for autistic people without intellectual disabilities.
Yeah, they tend to be
Because-
low support needs. They tend
Yep.
to have enough privilege and support in their own life that they can have careers in things like academia and the like, which is very difficult even for neurotypical people to get a career into, let alone in autistic people. And
Yep.
so far, there is a risk that there is a risk of it excluding ASD level 2 and level 3 people and not being aware of that bias. Throughout this research project, you've been very keenly aware of the bias, but it's in academia they almost blind themselves to it or hand wave it away, and there's a risk that could happen.
Yeah. And that's I've tried to do this before. I've given up because every time I attempt to do it, I just find a lot of problems that I don't want to cause, and I'm not comfortable doing the sort of hand wavy maneuvers.
Yeah.
And so here's the thing: I'm not telling anyone to not do this. I'm basically just saying that I think the problem either gets so complicated that it becomes difficult to articulate, or so simple that it's, do you even need to say this? or it becomes either intentionally or unintentionally exclusionary, or it will. Recently talking to a theology professor, and she was talking to me about how important it is for own voice theology, like theology done from a sort of standpoint epistemology perspective. And I think
Yeah.
there's merit to what she was saying. I think that there's also some, like you just pointed out, there are some issues with standpoint epistemology in that, or like your own voice, in that sometimes you are blind to your own privileges. And so one thing I pointed out is that a lot of the own voice autistic theology stuff was coming from people who were exclusively PhD havers, or like exclusively from very privileged academic backgrounds, and not including autistic people who are struggling with employment and all those types of things. And so, like I said, I'm not trying to say don't do that. I'm not trying to say you can't do it. I'm not trying to say no one can do it. I'm just saying that I personally think it is a problem that is too hard for me to effectively tackle. And so I don't think the move is to make an autistic theology. I think the move that we should be doing is to make a autistic practice, because practice, like a set of descriptions, a set of ways of doing things, a general set of rules, is much easier to go about and follow than a actual theology. It's practices you're just talking about basically different approach to adapting something to specific cultural concerns. And so that's why I'm going with an autistic Christianity rather than an autistic theology. That being said, we're coming up on almost an hour and a half, and to get into what exactly autistic Christianity is will take several hours, so I think we'll cut it here, and we will just cover what autistic Christianity actually is and what it actually looks like in the next episode. Any final thoughts, Amy, before we sign off?
Yeah, just appreciate everyone who's been listening to the pod so far. Yeah, and especially appreciate the patience that you all have in this re-recording. Obviously, extraordinary circumstances called for it, and we just appreciate your patience in this time with this. And I definitely look forward to the next few episodes where we really lay out the solutions. Like, it's nice to have this turning point where we've assessed the problem and now we're looking at what the hope is and what the solutions are, because I think that's something that would be appreciated. And I look forward to hearing the rest of it.
I'd just like to echo that. Now, since we're doing this recording in the middle of the podcast, I think it's interesting to now getting a lot of your feedback and getting a lot of your emails. I love
Yeah.
getting your emails. Keep sending them. I share them with Amy as well. Don't feel shy about it at all. If you ever want to just send an email, do it. I appreciate it. I like getting feedback. I like getting good feedback. Don't send me mean emails. I don't like those unless they're funny. Sometimes mean feedback is funny, but
Please make it entertaining.
Yeah. If you're gonna be mean, at least be funny. I'm gonna say that. All right, that's all we have. See ya. Thank you for listening to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. If you're interested in contacting me, you can find me at christianityonthespectrum@gmail.com or Twitter @ChristianityOn. You can find Amy at It Began in the 90s. It's 90 with a 90, also on Twitter. We'll be doing some Q&A episodes after the main podcast is finished. If you have any questions about my research, you can email me or send me a message on Twitter with your questions, and I will get to addressing them during that Q&A. If you want to do a live Q&A, schedule a talk or a presentation about my research for your church small group, or just as an individual person, you can find me at all the places I've already mentioned. If you'd like to join a Discord of like-minded autistics, please send me a message at one of the above listed places, and I will send you an invitation link. Thank you.